Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you for joining us in this time of crisis to hear David Bollier's talk, The Need for Second Responders to the Pandemic, the Pioneers of Institutional Innovation. I'm Rob West, Acquisitions Editor at New Society Publishers, and I'll be your host for today's talk. New Society Publishers is a solutions-oriented activist publisher based in British Columbia, Canada. Our mission is to publish books in a way that has a minimum impact on our environment, and our vision is to provide the world with fundamental tools to help build a just and ecologically sustainable society. This year, we are celebrating our 40th anniversary of publishing books for a world of change. Today's event is part of Radical May, an extensive and varied multilingual program of roundtables, talks, and debates about the ideas that will transform the world to come. Radical May is the collective effort of an alliance of 50 publishers, radical publishers from 11 countries and regions around the world, in cooperation with Literal, an annual festival of books and ideas held in Barcelona. Please check the Radical May website in the description below for more events during the month, as well as links for the Left Book Club with discount codes for books by our radical publishing partners. You can also find a link to New Society's own website, including current promotions, as well as a link to the Schumacher Center for a New Economics. The format of today's talk will be a brief introduction, a 30-minute talk by David Bollier, and then questions from viewers. Please post your questions for David in the comments below, and feel free to tell us where you're signing in from. I'd now like to turn to our guest. It's a pleasure to have with us David Bollier, one of the foremost scholars, thinkers, authors, and activists on commons and commenting in all its forms and expressions. David is co-founder of the Commons Strategy Group, a consulting project that works to promote the commons internationally. He was founding editor of onthecommons.org and fellow of On the Commons from 2004 to 2010. He is currently director of the Reinventing the Commons program at the Schumacher Center for a New Economics based in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. His work on the commons takes many forms: as an author and blogger, frequent international speaker, conference and workshop organizer, contributor to book anthologies, designer of courses on the commons, and advisor and strategist. An erudite thinker and prolific writer, David has authored, co-authored, and edited 12 books. His first book on the commons, Silent Theft, The Private Plunder of Our Commons Wealth, published in 2002, is a far-ranging survey of market enclosures and shared resources from public lands and the airwaves to creativity and knowledge. His 2014 book, Think Like a Commoner, A Short History of the Life of the Commons, published by New Society, is a concise distillation of this thinking on the commons that has been translated into 7 languages. David's most recent book, Free, Fair, and Alive, The Insurgent Power of the Commons, co-authored with Silke Helfrich and published by New Society in 2019, is a penetrating cultural critique, table-pounding political treatise, and practical playbook for commenting. In late March, commenting on the worldwide eruption of mutual aid groups and commenting as a grassroots response to the coronavirus pandemic, George Monbiot wrote about David and Silke's book in The Guardian. Quote, in their book, Free, Fair, and Alive, David Bollier and Silke Helfrich define the commons as a social form that enables people to enjoy freedom without repressing others, enact fairness without bureaucratic control, and assert sovereignty without nationalism. The commons are neither capitalist nor communist, market nor state. They are an insurgency of social power in which we come together as equals to confront our shared predicaments, unquote. Springboarding off of this idea of the commons as an insurgency of social power, the title of David's talk today is The Need for Second Responders to the Pandemic, the Pioneers of Institutional Innovation. But what exactly does this mean? I'll let David answer that question, but by way of context, I again quote George Monbiot in the same Guardian article, penned as the pandemic started to unfold. Quote, you can watch neoliberalism collapsing in real time, Governments whose mission was to shrink the state, to cut taxes and borrowing, and dismantle public services are discovering that the market forces they fetishized cannot defend us from this crisis. The theory has been tested and almost everywhere abandoned. It may not be true that there were no atheists in the trenches, but there are no neoliberals in a pandemic. The shift is even more interesting than it first appears. Power has migrated not just from private money to the state, but from both market and state to another place altogether, the commons. All over the world, communities have mobilized where governments have failed, unquote. So as the pandemic reveals the barren, inhumane nature of neoliberal capitalism and the client state, it also exposes deep cracks into which the crowbars of fresh ideas can be wedged. At this historic fracture point, commoning along the primary form of human social and economic relations is now once again part of a larger unfolding conversation about how to imagine post-capitalist futures as the pandemic so vividly reveals the deficiency of the market state system. It is perhaps here that David's second responders are so desperately needed. I'll now turn proceedings over to David Bollier, who is joining us from Amherst, Massachusetts. Welcome, David, and good afternoon.
Thank you, Rob, for that introduction, and I'm thrilled to be with this. I'm looking forward to the discussion we can have afterwards. I'm feeling conflicted at this moment because I have this huge desire to listen and learn and empathize with everything that's going on. And at the same time, I'm very impatient to try to start to reimagine our social institutions while the emergencies are still raging. And this is kind of an irresistible project because the pandemic is revealing just how deeply flawed some of our societal institutions really are. And it's showing how and why governments are so unresponsive and ineffectual, how it hasn't dealt with wealth inequality, how it's not dealt with the problems of the world's ecosystems, and so many other institutional systems from higher education to journalism to the arts. And then some could say that the pandemic is really just a warm-up for climate change and other ecosystem troubles that lie ahead. So I really think despite the presence of the emergencies that we need to deal with, we also need to pause and start to think about midterm changes in our economy and governance and culture. And as I've suggested, we need second responders to start this process to try to emancipate ourselves from some archaic and ineffectual institutions and infrastructures. And because we have to avoid reverting to some old ideological patterns of thought as if the pandemic were simply a temporary break from the normal. I don't think normal is coming back, and the new normal, in fact, may already be here. So we have to take the opportunity that the pandemic provides to rethink some of our big systems, while at the same time confronting some of the inner realities that will have to change as well. We need to reflect and feel and connect with others to see the deprivation and the suffering and to understand our interdependencies and to see how these inner feelings need to be brought into alignment with our external institutions. So for the next 25 or 30 minutes, I'd like to focus on some specific possibilities for institutional change in relocalization and agriculture and food and cities and digital spaces and social life, among other areas. I think our years of leisurely critique of neoliberal capitalism are over, and we need to start to take action to escape from some of the pathologies because we're experiencing the results of that. Why are we having this conversation now? I think because the pandemic has opened our minds. The failures of existing institutions have shown that we need to entertain some fresh possibilities that were dismissed only a few months ago. I was shocked to see how the Financial Times of London has called for universal basic income and how congressional Republicans in the US have embraced trillions of dollars of spending for all sorts of social services and unemployment insurance without considering it public debt. And as Rob noted, there's no libertarians in a pandemic. Once again, mutualization and forms of socialism have come to the aid of capitalism when it's on its knees. At a deeper level, I think the pandemic is reacquainting us with something that we moderns have denied for quite some time, that we're actually human beings who depend upon living biological systems, and that we're profoundly interdependent on each other, despite our presumptions to be autonomous individuals. There was a famous Margaret Thatcher quote in the early 1980s when neoliberalism was just taking hold that said, there is no such thing as society, there are just individuals. Well, that's obviously being proven false. I recently read an essay by Andreas Weber, a German eco-philosopher and biologist, called Nourishing Community in Pandemic Times. And he wrote, the corona pandemic makes us understand that the earth is a commons and that our lives are shared. This insight is not a rational concept, but springs from an emotional need. Individuals accept hardships by restricting their contacts, tax in order to protect community. The understanding that we need to protect others has been able to override economic certainties within days. Humans choose to put reciprocity first. Reciprocity, mutual care, is neither an abstract concept nor an economic policy, but the experience of a sharing relationship and ultimately the keeping of a community intact. And that was reflected in that George Monbiot column that Rob mentioned, in which he documented dozens of spontaneous mutual aid projects around the world that sprang up by ordinary people to deal with the results of the pandemic. And I think it reflects something deep within us that this reflexively happens. There's two other hard-bitten reasons that I think we need to talk about institutional innovation right now. One, there's the decline of market valuation of many businesses and assets and bankruptcies. And this means in a perverse way that it will become easier to reconfigure land and buildings and equipment into commons infrastructure. For this, I think we're going to need a whole new class of what I call conversion to commons strategies, which I'll discuss in a moment. Another reason we need to talk about institutional innovation is because historically, at moments of crisis, one can think of the Great Depression and the New Deal. You can think of the recessions that have affected the tech industry. It was the 2002 recession that led to some of the most robust tech innovation because suddenly programmers didn't have to code for business model software. They could do what they wanted or what they thought was socially useful. And what came out of that, but the whole blogosphere, social media, and many other things that have become basic elements of our online experience. So with the New Deal, necessity became the mother of invention and created all sorts of new forms of government responses. Interestingly, there was a whole decentralist school of thought in the New Deal that lost to the centralizers. I find that a fascinating sub-story because we need to remind ourselves that everything is in play right now and that our vision can make a difference because of things are so open right now. So in this crisis, we have the permission to innovate, to deviate from the standard capitalist business models, to reinvent the state, to develop systems to promote commoning. So let me segue into the commons. As some of you know, I've been a longtime scholar and activist focused on the commons, studying the theory and the practice and the social life of commons for about the past 20 years. And currently I do this work as the director of the Reinventing the Commons program at the Schumacher Center for New Economics here in Massachusetts. So I've studied hundreds of commons and traveled and studied them closely. I've concluded that they have really great promise in addressing the challenges of this moment. Now, 8 months ago, my colleague Silke Helfrich and I published our book, Free, Fair, and Alive, which was our attempt to distill and synthesize our 15 or 20 years of experience of studying commons as a social and economic alternative. We see the commons discourse not only as an insightful way to critique capitalism, but as a fantastic way to talk about creative, constructive alternatives that have a different logic, a different ethos, a different mindset and worldview. And even better, it's not just a rhetorical or philosophical statement, it's about functional working alternatives that are meeting needs in non-capitalist ways with the active participation of commoners and their creativity, all informed by their local context and culture and history. So it's a different model than the whole ideological debates of public or private, government or market. It gets beyond that. So I think with the Commons, we have the opportunity to leapfrog over a lot of tired debates about socialism versus capitalism, both of which are centralized, hierarchical, state-based systems. So we need to open up some new vistas of possibility that depend upon distributed action, place-based initiatives, internet-friendly approaches that go beyond the whole market and state debate. Now, developing the commons also makes a lot of sense in a world in which electoral politics has been captured and corrupted by capitalism. The nation state is too closely aligned with capital to seriously think about transformational change. Political ideology and power have largely triumphed over serious ideas and debate, and economic growth has become biophysically impossible, even if the state continues to prop it up with huge subsidies and legal entitlements and so on. Into this situation, COVID-19 has come, proving itself probably to be the most powerful political actor of our time, because it's disrupting countless premises of modern life and politics and economics. And it's really, I think, brought us to a fork in the road. Should we, one, try to restore the brittle, tightly integrated global markets based on neoliberal fantasies of unlimited economic growth and technological progress? Even though the system requires, of course, horrific extractivism from nature, racism, inequality, neocolonialism, patriarchy, and many other serious issues. And even though small local perturbances like a virus can then bring the whole system down once it propagates. Should we have that scenario of the normal that we want to revert to? Or should we try to build a more distributed, resilient, eco-mindful, place-based system that puts limits on the use of nature, that invites widespread participation and creativity, that cultivates placemaking cultures and assures a rough social fairness for everyone? Well, it's more than a rhetorical question because this is very here and now and part of the choices we face. But as the explosion of mutual aid projects in the face of the pandemic has demonstrated, there's a cultural energy and yearning and desire for this to happen. For me, the concern is, can those impulses survive over the long haul? And the answer for me is we need to develop the institutional and legal and financial support systems so that they can, so that the mutual aid doesn't become just a cultural paroxysm that disappears once the crisis is apparently over. So I think we're in a race to articulate a positive, progressive vision, even as many reactionaries and libertarians and so-called conservatives try to revert to an old normal of unsustainable capitalism, which, as we've seen in some places, is starting to degenerate into authoritarianism or fascism. We see this with Trumpism, we see this with corporate data surveillance that's increasing, we see this with the armed protests against the shelter-at-home requirements. So I would argue that we need to build new types of infrastructures and institutions revolving around the commons and going far beyond the apparent promises of the Green New Deal and Democratic Party centrism. Because the old paradigm is falling apart, but the new ones have not been fully crystallized and developed. And since politicians and economists are not the most innovative breed and are not likely to lead us in that direction, the burden falls on us to try to step up and sketch a new societal vision. And I'd like to leave the macro policy discussion for another day because that's an enormous topic in its own right. And I want to focus on the institutional innovations. But let me just quickly reference a very interesting 5-point agenda that I saw that emerged in a Dutch manifesto for change in the industrialized world. It called on 5 points: a shift from an economy focused on GDP growth to differentiate among sectors so that critical public sectors in clean energy and education and healthcare get investment, while sectors that need to radically degrow, such as oil, gas, mining, advertising, would not get support or investment. We need to build an economic framework focused on redistribution, which could contain everything from universal basic income to strong progressive taxation to reduced working hours. 3, we need to transform farming into regenerative agriculture, which of course is an enormous topic itself. We need to reduce consumption and travel to only those things that are most basic, necessary, and sustainable. And we need debt cancellation, especially for workers, small business owners, and countries in the global South. But since it's very hard to sort of get to these macro policies in one broad jump, I think it's imperative that we focus on a lot of the things we can do ourselves right now without having to rely upon politicians or regulatory agencies and the rest to sanction them or facilitate them. There are things that we can do right now in our own places. And these are commons-based institutions. Now, pre-pandemic, the idea of creating commons and having local place-based institutions was kind of a non-starter because the neoliberal vision of development was so pervasive and powerful, and it was seen as just marginal to defy that idea, which was the only serious, credible template for policy, politics, and economics. So, of course, that's changed because I think the pandemic has ripped the veil off the neoliberal capitalist narrative and exposed many of its flawed assumptions. We now see how we truly are embedded in the world's biological living ecosystems. We see how we really are social creatures who depend upon each other to survive and flourish. And we see that there are many existing functional models outside of the market state system upon which we can build. So this is a very confounding time, I think, because we're experiencing what Andreas Weber, referencing a book by the Portuguese sociologist de Souza Santos, calls the microbial destruction of the Western cognitive empire. His point is that the whole Hobbesian vision of society governed by a social contract and a world composed of dead things that we can use however we wish is essentially a libertarian fantasy. The conceit that we're an ahistorical, decontextualized, isolated individuals and that we're rational, utility maximizing materialists, again, is empirically incorrect. It's only a partial story. The Enlightenment conceit that we can separate humanity from nature, the individual from the collective, the mind from the body, these two are kind of empirically wrong and somewhat ridiculous. So in some ways, it's an understatement to say that the coronavirus is destroying the capitalist global economy. It's really destroying the epistemological edifice upon which we all have stood. And we're starting to realize that the world is really a kind of pulsating superorganism that's alive with living agents, including ourselves. And that's one reason there's so much talk about the new animism, because the idea of Gaia, the earth as a living system, is getting greater credibility and traction. So rebuilding the world will require more than just new economic policies. It will require a new mindset about existential existence on planet Earth. So with that brief introduction, I think let me talk about some of the new forms of commoning, infrastructure, finance, and commons public partnerships that I think can help get us there. Now, I don't purport that this is a complete list. There are many other topics for a paradigm shift that we can and should talk about it. But these are ones that are more central to the commons vision, and I think have a certain virtue of being practically functionally oriented. Number one, I think we need to relocalize ourselves through such things as community-supported agriculture, through community land trusts, and some derivations of those, such as import replacement strategies, where localities can start to produce things on their own that substitute for things they used to get for the global economy. So this means things like CSA farms, in which upfront sharing of risks help farmers and help support local healthy agriculture. And I might add the CSA model has potentially many applications. Here where I live in Western Massachusetts, there's actually a jazz performance series that has a CSA model where subscribers pay up front for a whole season of jazz performances. So it's an interesting model for bypassing the traditional market or state-based provisioning of things. And I mentioned earlier, convert to commons strategies. I think we need to have ways to start to conceptualize how we can move private assets to collective ones so that people can relocalize infrastructure. Nathan Schneider, an academic at the University of Colorado Boulder, talks a lot about exit to community strategies, whereby companies, instead of just going public or being bought by the tech giants, have an exit to community strategy where they can be mutualized and owned by the community and managed by the community. This needs to be explored more. Similarly, community land trusts can be used as vehicles for starting to mutualize real estate now held in private hands and trying to decommodify it and get it out of the always soaring speculative real estate market. I know that in Great Britain, they actually have a assets of community value law that gives communities the right, the first right under law to buy businesses like pubs or other resources and to make them community assets. Another part of this is a major part of it is the relocalization of food production and distribution systems. As we've seen how brittle the global food supply systems are and how carbon intensive they are, there's a huge rush to try to accelerate efforts to regionalize the agriculture systems and the distribution and retailing systems for food. And that's enormously important as going forward if we want to have a resilient system that won't be interrupted and potentially leave people unable to buy healthy food. I mean, this was a problem even before the pandemic, but it's become even more severe. I've taken a lot of comfort in the writings of a professor, Jose Luis Vivero Pol, who has written about food as a commons and the right to food, and he's trying to reimagine local food systems so that food just doesn't become a global commodity or highly processed junk that may or may not be available to people. It becomes something that is local, regional, and organically connected to an ecosystem in one's region. There are some really interesting examples of this, like the Fresno Commons in the San Joaquin Valley in California, where they have a stakeholder trust that manages a lot of the food system as infrastructure. And they have targeted projects to help assure that locally grown produce is accessible and affordable to everyone. Basically, it mutualizes a lot of what would otherwise be considered profit or surplus and makes sure that it's applied for the benefit of everyone. Other farmers are starting to explore the use of data analytics to build new types of cooperative supply systems that can benefit them and not the third-party middlemen or retailers. And others are trying to use open source design systems to build cheaper agricultural equipment. There's groups like FarmHack and Open Source Ecology that are doing this. Another way to start to make locally producible farm equipment more affordable and used. So this brings me to a third idea, a third general kind of institutional innovation called cosmo-local production. And this is a kind of production in which the design for things, the knowledge, is shared among global design communities over the internet, open source style. But the building of physical things, the heavy stuff, are done locally. And that's the kind of, I mentioned the farm equipment, but this is happening in a whole number of different areas, such as motor vehicles and furniture and modular houses and electronics and many other things. And there's promise for developing more locally based, but still very innovative types of industry in these sectors on this model. There are issues that need to be dealt with, to be sure. One of them is how do you have collateral for lending or finance when there's no intellectual property, when the designs are non-proprietary? It's a serious concern, but on the other hand, the upside of such kind of production for reducing our carbon footprint, for being locally embedded and socially responsible is enormous. So we need to figure out new types of finance and law for that kind of institutional innovation. A fourth area that I would commend is called platform cooperatives, where this is using internet models that it's sort of the socially responsible equivalent of Airbnb and Uber, which are of course designed to extract money from localities and cities and send it to Silicon Valley investors. Platform cooperatives reverse the process by mutualizing the surplus for the benefit of the workers, whether they're taxi owners or apartment owners, and for the benefit of the people who live there, so that it's not simply a rip and run type gig economy platform. It's something that is socialized, domesticated, and beneficial for people. In Texas, they started a platform co-op for taxi drivers. And I know there's platform co-ops for food delivery workers in Berlin and for messaging workers in Barcelona and freelance workers in Brussels, as well as here in the US. And recently, some of you may have read about this new platform for independent bookstores called bookshop.org that is trying to take on Amazon by getting at least a minor percentage of sales of books through, it's not a co-op, but more of it's a for-benefit corporation, but it gives 75% of its profits to independent local bookstores. These are the kinds of innovations that we need to develop more to deal with the increasingly concentrated corporate sector, which is only going to get more concentrated as there's the small business die-off occurs during the pandemic. All the more reason that we need to, have these types of innovations. I might add that platform cooperatives need not be market-driven. They could be mutual aid platforms of the sort discussed earlier, or time banking platforms that enable people to share services in a credit barter system, or free cycle platforms that allow people to give and take and share things for free. So a lot of potential there. At a certain point, we reach what I call infrastructure innovation. We need to design physical, legal, and administrative infrastructure to make it easier to engage in commenting. I'm a great admirer of this massive Wi-Fi system in Catalonia, Spain, called GuiFiNet, which has more than 30,000 nodes on the internet, and it's high quality but affordable Wi-Fi broadband service that's run as a commons, a fantastic infrastructure. In Oakland, California, there's something called the Omni Commons, which is a big building that is basically a collective property for artisans and hackers and social entrepreneurs and activists. And once again, having this kind of administrative and financial infrastructure allows these people to carry on their work without having to be a heroic individual with enormous persistence. You can more easily do it, just like you can do a lot of market things very easily because there's the infrastructure for it. Creative Commons licenses are an example of legal infrastructure that facilitates sharing and cooperation. We need new types of laws to facilitate commenting. And land is a very important infrastructure that needs to be reclaimed for public and long-term purposes, rather than simply used as a commodity for speculative purposes, which just forecloses using land for the social needs we have, whether it's affordable housing or agroecology and local food. Another type of innovation along the lines of infrastructures are known as shareholder trusts. Some of you may have heard of the Alaska Permanent Fund, where revenues from oil drilling in Alaska goes into a trust held, independent trust held for the benefit of the public. And that trust kicks off dividends on the order of $1,000 to $2,000 a year that goes to every citizen in Alaska. It's a rare source of non-labor income that people have from their public wealth. Peter Barnes is a commentator in his book Capitalism 3.0, and in a forthcoming book, who elaborates on these ideas and how they could be more generalized and used to help take existing common wealth that we have, and where appropriate to monetize it, put it into a trust fund that can benefit all of us. So a final category I'll just mention, but not go into great length, is commons-based finance. We need to develop new ways to finance commons-based projects that don't depend upon debt or equity in traditional ways, which tend to dictate what types of social and economic behavior people can have, because you have to grow in order to pay back that debt. And it's just a cash relationship as opposed to a community relationship. So there are all sorts of collective forms of finance, like mutual aid societies and insurance, or crowd gifting and crowd equity. I mentioned community land trusts and CSAs already. Things like platform cooperatives and the exit to commons strategy for converting private property to commons. These are some of the ideas that could help develop more socially benign but still accountable forms of finance. So this is an area that we really need a lot more innovation in. And a larger topic that I won't get into, but I'll just reference, is how state governments, whether it's at state or federal level, but especially at the city or town level, can play a very constructive role in entering into what I call commons public partnerships, using the resources and money and legal authority of the state to facilitate people taking charge of projects that they run. It's not so different from the way the state charters corporations and gives corporations the legal authority to do all sorts of activities. Why can't we have charters for the commons, for people to undertake activities with that kind of a public benefit? There are obviously other categories we could talk about, like care work, the need for assisting the global South and elevating indigenous peoples' models of taking care of business, but I will leave those for another discussion. I just want to conclude by saying, you know, we've been brought up to believe by many of our politicians and business leaders that there is no alternative. Margaret Thatcher famously said in defense of neoliberalism, there is no alternative. Well, the truth is the acronym TAPAS, T-A-P-A-S, there are plenty of alternatives, as I think I've suggested. But we need to find the ways to work together to develop these institutional models and to communicate them to commoners and the general public. And my bet is that the dysfunctionality of current systems will propel a strong continuing interest in these commons-based models. But still, we have a lot of work to do in consolidating the ideas, refining them, experimenting with them, building out the legal structures and the financial supports, building out the infrastructure. But I think there's an enormous energy and desire to take greater charge, greater self-determination for solutions that work. And that's going to become only more intense as the pandemic continues and as we try to recover from it. So those are some of my thoughts about how we might move forward. And I would welcome having a longer conversation now with Rob's help with anybody who's checked in into this conversation.
Great. Well, thank you very much, David, for that stimulating talk. There's a lot packed into there. Maybe we can unpack a bit of it with some questions from my end and from listeners and viewers elsewhere. One thing that strikes me in your talk is when you talk about the sort of Hobbesian vision. You quoted Margaret Thatcher a few times, always important to keep her somehow, her ability to capture the essence of an idea and plant it in the seeds of the public in a way that has allowed it to thrive or be thrust upon the public. So one question I have about, I know you didn't want to go there on the big scale so much, but I think I always feel that the framing at the large scale is necessary. The role of the state here. So what people will be, there'll be a big drive to return to business as usual, as you mentioned. And what are the, in terms of places in which commoning is much more common and successful than it is in the sort of neoliberal heartlands of the sort of Anglo-American world. Is there some difference in the way that the state is oriented towards the population than it is in the British model or the American model? Is there something fundamentally different there?
Well, I mean, I agree with your point that especially in the US, there is such a long-standing tradition of skepticism or hostility to government that has been fomented and developed by rich billionaires, because they too, the Koch brothers want their economic liberty protected and not a mass public economic liberty. But your question is a good one. Governments need to see the upside for the public good and for themselves as government in cooperating with commoners. And you see this a lot in European cities like Barcelona and Amsterdam. You see it Bologna, Italy, Seoul, Korea as well. And I think a lot of those governments are starting to realize that the upside of constantly cultivating outside investors, absentee investment, is starting to corrode their cities. Airbnb has hollowed out a lot of neighborhoods, and they're now basically tourist destinations, and the residents have been expelled because investors can make more money catering to tourists. So I think a lot of enlightened and activist-minded mayors and movements are starting to see, there's limits to what we can acquire in terms of funding from the state, and much more that can be had by leveraging people's goodwill and energy and participation. Now, I grant you that that's a cultural barrier that will have to be overcome in many areas. But I think functionally, it's hard to dispute with some of the results where governments are pulling in the same direction with citizens instead of trying to tamp them down while rewarding the rich 1%.
Right. Okay. Well, there's an interesting question from a viewer which parallels something that you just said and that I'd been thinking of, which is the role of imagination in all of this. So, and culture. So we have this situation where we've had, 70 years of mass consumerism, several decades of intense globalization, and a great homogenization of culture. So when Margaret Thatcher says, there is no alternative, well, in a lot of people's minds, there's a void of alternatives. So one of the viewers, Jamie Gullen, has asked, wondering if you can speak to the role of arts and culture in activating the commons and envisioning a better future. So I guess this idea of filling that void with a different vision and the role for that creative side to reinvent culture.
Well, I agree entirely with that questioner's pointing out of arts and culture playing a role, because I have a lot of collaborative conversations with theater people who see arts and culture as a way to express and feel and publicly communicate feelings that are not otherwise being expressed. And I know a lot of my right side of the brain friends have trouble communicating that. We're captive to a lot of the ideological and political structures and categories we have. I think arts and culture can help us reinterpret and express this alternative reality, much as music in the 1960s expressed a different societal vision. And I would add, to the extent that the commons is about recovering wholeness and about relationality, that's the strong suit of arts and culture. And I would see those artists of all types helping us, lead us forward, because we know what we're feeling, we're just not having it expressed very well, particularly by words alone. So I think that's an important thing, to expand the imagination. Having said all of that, I think there's also a need for the policy experts, the lawyers, the innovative financiers to develop new structures and systems to build on that energy. But yeah, let's culturally express it.
So in that, you mentioned the commons is inherently locally based. There's sort of that in-place connection that humanity has had until quite very recently. And we talked about this role of culture. We have one of the viewers, Eric Best, has asked a couple of questions here. One is about, he says, the problem is that so many in the developed world were raised in the amid neoliberal mythologies and the power structures profit therefrom. How do we re-educate and influence the many very fast? And he asked this question above that related to, could you imagine something like Facebook, which is, for example, reaching, I don't know, 1/7 of the world, people have voluntarily signed up. If the cultural aspect and commenting is inherently localized, what role is there for these, if a role at all, for these macro level systems, very, global systems, and how much can they influence a transformation of people's thinking?
Well, a lot of people say to me, the commons is so small, how do you scale it? And I think that's somewhat the wrong question. Yes, we want greater scope of influence, but I think that comes through keeping the appropriate scale, meaning communities that can interact meaningfully with each other. But it's a matter of emulating and federating, so that it's not one big massive centralized structure, but horizontally connected structures that are locally responsive to their participants and members. So I think that's one answer for how we move forward. And I think it does have to be propelled culturally by meeting needs. I hesitate at the word re-education. I think it's more a matter of showing the appeal and beauty and wholesomeness of alternatives that exist. And those need to be hoisted up again. And I think a lot of us in the pandemic are experiencing these elemental existential human realities that the fantasy world of capitalist culture has denied us for so long. And the contrast between celebrity culture and celebrities traipsing across our consciousness now is very different than it was 2 months ago. People see celebrity culture as somewhat ridiculous when we're talking about human realities. So my hope and aspiration is that we're going to rediscover some of these human realities, some of which are extremely difficult, and I don't want to sugarcoat anything. They're very difficult, but I also would say we're having some authentic relational encounters. And in some ways, given the fantasy world or the not denial we were in, this is a worthy place to go and explore. So culture will help us lead the direction, I think.
Right. And one thing that I think about often, especially in your book, Free, Fair, and Alive, which I'll just put up here for the benefit of viewers, which is amazing. This book, it sits by my bedside, and I'm not making that up to people on the internet. It does sit by my bedside. One of the things that I find interesting in there is just how prevalent the commons actually are, even in the neoliberal heartland. Yet they seem invisible. Examples of it seem invisible to us often. So we've had one viewer ask about, could you give some examples of community level commons that we can apply now that could be modeled nearly everywhere, specifically for elder care, the food system. So one aspect of that is the specific examples, but the other is perhaps they're already there and we're just not seeing them. Is there a way in which we help people remove the scales from their eyes and commenting becomes visible? Are there some toolkit or tools we can put out there to listeners?
Well, I think at the spontaneous reflexive level, it's baked into what we are as humans. Look at when the pandemic immediately hit, the spontaneous creation of these mutual aid societies to buy groceries for elderly people and help take care of their needs. Nobody was directing that from city government or from the market. It was spontaneous. I think however, having said that, let's get to some institutional models so they can have some durability and modest resources and maybe some infrastructure to make it all go easier so that it's not a heroic individual task. I mean, that's what the time banking movement is all about, is creating this non-market credit system where you give us an hour of your time, whether it's leaf raking or taking care of someone's pet or helping an elderly person, and you get $1 time bank for you, which you can then spend for services for you. That's something that's not so difficult to create right now. There are other models of localized, relocalized behavior. I mentioned CSAs, community supported agriculture, and community land trusts. Obviously, these take a little more effort and institutional work and money to get going, but they're not rocket science either. They're very proven local formats. And I think part of the challenge is start to bring some of these models together along with a lot of the great groups that are doing like the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, the Schumacher Center, Garo Paravitz's Democracy Collaborative, Ted Howard, many others who are on the tail of this relocalization and the self-determination that can come from it. But they've been marginalized historically, and the pandemic has shown how truly relevant and important they are.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we see that, it's interesting, the group that brought this event, that spurred the beginning of this event, spontaneously arose out of a bunch of small radical publishers around the world in sudden cooperation for mutual aid purposes. And I've sat back and reflected on that and thought, where and why and how did that exactly happen? Why why were we compelled to join?
I think that it's partly with these momentary dissolution of these familiar structures, which are regularized, routinized, market-driven. Our imagination starts to pop up and we start to think differently, and we get in touch with different elements of ourselves. And lo and behold, the radical May events emerged. I mean, I think that's sort of what commenting is all about in terms of opening it to a broader array of voices and letting these things surface. Having said that, nothing's automatic. It takes work to make them happen. So that too is a challenge.
It does. And so do you have suggestions for viewers who might be new to commenting in terms of how they might start to put it into practice where they are? So you mentioned some examples. Are there key things to understand, or is there a brief playbook? Are there some principles? How do you begin commenting? There you are, sitting, isolated, in the world of Margaret Thatcher. Now we're all social distance. How is it you're excited by this idea?
Well, the obvious limitation is the social distancing makes it harder to have the group discussions we need to have. We can, in the meantime, perhaps do our Zooms and others. So there'll be some constraints for the short or midterm. I think the thing to understand about the commons is it's not as if you can just grasp it by reading a single magazine article or even one book. There are so many different levels to this, from economics and policy to culture and social practice to international manifestations from the European countries to the global South to indigenous cultures to the different mindsets and worldviews and ontological perspectives that the commons presents. With my work with Silke Helfrich, a German activist and scholar, have tried to bring some of these things together in my books, obviously Free, Fair, and Alive, but a previous book called Think Like a Commoner is an introduction to the commons, which is just a 100-page book, which is a quick way to get an overview of the commons. But then there's two books which are anthologies, both of which are free and online, Patterns of Commoning at patternsofcommoning.org, and The Wealth of the Commons at wealthofthecommons.org. And there's some fantastic essays that go into greater depth and diversity about types of commons out there. So that can give people an idea of what's truly possible, not only possible, what's existing and flourishing right now, and how this represents an alternative politics, an alternative economics, an alternative to modernity and some of its problems. So there's, as I say, this is not a quick study. It can take a lot of work. Having said that, certain projects you don't need to be a scholar to do. You need to have energy and a group of people who decide, I want to manage this for the benefit of everyone in a fair, inclusive, long-term way. And that's really the short definition of a commons.
Right. So really, a small group of people can get started right away in some form of commoning.
I have to say, I've been surprised in my life as a commons scholar running across improbable commons like hackers who create open source street maps in the wake of natural disasters so that first responders can respond. In Boston, there's a HowlRound Theater Commons to promote plays and theater productions that are open to everyone and not just commercially driven affairs. So in short, the commons can arise in very unusual circumstances. It's just when there's a group of people to get together and say, we want to create a commons here.
Right, and we have this, spontaneous eruption happening in this time of crisis. We talked about how this is fertile ground for new thinking and, cracks for crowbars of new ideas to be inserted and wedged against the system. But we have a question from a viewer, Oswald Spengler, saying, how much danger does David think there is of the commons, and in being co-opted by the right wing? And we know historically the commons largely have been
it's a good question. There's a whole blood and soil movement that wants to reclaim the land for the nationalist tribe. And I think there is danger, but it's also true that there's other traditions of commoning that are more inclusive and enlightened. And I think we have to fight for that. But I don't think that by any means do such reactionary movements have a capture or hold on the commons. They too, I would say, are in some ways reacting to the dysfunctionality and pathologies of the global market system. And the point of the commons is to start to show that value and identity and culture are created in different ways than some of those socially mindless and predatory ways that the conventional economy works. So that's what we need to help remake. And I think that the commons in their many forms are a vehicle for starting to have those conversations, starting to amass the political power to have effects at the macro level.
Right. So there is real hope that the Trump base, for example, these people who are, historically, many of them are at the sort of, bottom of the pile in American society, the ones who the American dream has forever remained outside their grasp. And so they've latched onto this populist vision that it's, globalists that are behind all of our ills. That energy, many of those, the legitimate grievances of those people could be addressed through commoning.
Absolutely, because I don't think commons is an ideological movement or force. Just look at the Transition Town movement, which is very inclusive. Do you have something to contribute? Please join us. we're doing something to improve the local world. And so it's not something that is driven by this void in identity or great insecurity and fear. I think we need to start to address that in a way that conventional politics really hasn't. And that involves serious dialogue, not othering people, starting to see the humanity of others and the contributions people can make despite being left behind in the globalized market world. So yeah, that's an important unmet debate that politics doesn't want to go to right now.
Right. And I think that, that's obviously essential to harmonious living within limits in a world that we have now that's so populated and under so much pressure. Perhaps the last question before we wrap things up here is from Eric Best, who has asked, and I think Eric, just looking at some of his comments, seems particularly concerned about the rapid international change. So he's asking whether there's anyone specifically or groups trying to coalesce the commoning organizations and efforts into a whole rather than acting independently. So this idea of federating, I think, as you mentioned. So is there a source, or is there a focal point of commoning federalization in the world, if that's even a word? Is there a place to point people to connect once they have commons underway in their locality?
I'm sad to say no. There is a lot of horizontal, irregular connections among different commons projects. There is no, and I don't even think I'd want a centralized organization. Having said that, having some sort of meeting space, secretariat, ways for different commoners to have interchange with each other would be enormously valuable. It's just been largely a non-starter because there's so few resources for something that's so out there by the lights of conventional politics and economics. So no, there hasn't been that kind of infrastructure. Having said that, there is a lot in Europe, especially. There's common summer schools. There's a francophone network of commoners. There's Global South people. There's the International Association for the Study of the Commons. There's a lot of different commons related enterprises that are transnational and sporadically, irregularly in communication with each other. Clearly that needs to improve, and perhaps it will improve as the commons becomes a more recognized and robust way of moving forward.
Right. So there is a lot going on there. We just have to look for it, and lo and behold,
yeah, it just hasn't been visible. It hasn't been visible. I mean, I've made it my business to try to know a lot of these things, but it doesn't have a lot of mainstream currency. So it's not getting around as much as I think it could.
So before we wrap up, is there anything, last points you want to make about how we can energize ourselves, all of us, to become those second responders for, let me just put it out there for the last 20 seconds, David. Where do I go from here?
I think that having a positive, constructive focal point for our energies is really good for this moment, because we have a lot of anxiety and fear. I do. All of us do. And we also know that a lot of the conventional political figures and institutions in the US and globally are not going to step up, are not going to be able to deliver. They don't have what I would call the affordances, the capacity to deal with this. So I'd like to see those people who are into the commons start to have more horizontal communication and start to innovate and start to become more of a force, which I think many of them already are. It's just that this moment makes it more urgent and imperative for it to happen. So we'll see. It's the wheel is spinning, and we'll see what direction we go.
Well, very wise words, David. Together, we're stronger. It's an antidote to fear and anxiety. Bind together with your friends, your colleagues, and people like mind, and make something happen. I think we'll wrap it up there. I'd like to thank you very much for a stimulating talk that I hope energizes lots of our viewers to take some action. I'd like to thank my colleague Sarah Reeves, who's been in the background the whole time, who coordinated this whole event, as well as the Radical May Organizing Committee out there strewn around the world, for putting mutual aid into action in these times of crisis. And if you, the viewer, would like to explore the insurgent power of the commons more deeply, please do check out David's works on his website, on our website at New Society. And we hope we'll see you out there commenting. So thank you again, David. Thank you, viewers, and goodbye for now.
Thank you.